Somewhere inside a genetics lab, on a quiet afternoon that started like any other, a group of scientists ran a routine comparison. They were lining up ancient human DNA against the largest genetic databases on Earth. It was supposed to be a formality. Confirm the lineage, log the data, move to the next sample. Then the numbers came back wrong. Not wrong like a typo. Not wrong like a contaminated sample. Wrong in a way that made the room go quiet. The DNA in front of them did not match anything. Not any population in Africa. Not any population in Asia. Not any population in Europe. Not any group of people who had ever been sequenced, cataloged, or recorded in the entire history of human genetics. It was human. That much was certain. But it belonged to no one alive today. No descendants, no relatives, no trace of it in a single living person on the planet. A ghost, hiding inside a fragment of bone. And here is the part that should unsettle you. That was not an isolated glitch. Over the last few years, as scientists have pushed deeper and deeper into the genetic code of humanity, they have found this same pattern again and again. Entire populations that lived, breathed, raised children, buried their dead, and then vanished so completely that modern science did not even know to look for them. Populations with no place in the story we have been telling ourselves for over a century. The story that says humanity divides neatly into races, that those races have deep, separate roots, that if you trace your ancestry back far enough, you land cleanly in one branch of the tree. That story is not just incomplete, it is wrong. And the DNA itself is what's proving it. To understand why this matters, and why the discovery we're about to walk through shook the scientific community to its core, you need to understand what DNA actually does. Not in a textbook way, in a real way. Every cell in your body carries a copy of your genome, roughly 3 billion genetic letters long. If you tried to print it out, it would fill a library. And embedded in that code is something remarkable, a record. Every small mutation, every tiny change that gets passed from parent to child builds up over time at a fairly steady rate. Generation after generation, century after century. Scientists use that steady buildup the way a geologist uses rock layers. It's a clock. Compare two genomes, count the differences, and you can estimate how long ago those two lineages split apart. Do that across thousands of people, ancient and modern, and you can reconstruct migrations, splits, and reunions going back hundreds of thousands of years. It is one of the most powerful tools ever built for understanding where we come from. And the first time it was used at scale in the year 2000, it delivered a verdict that stunned the public. When the Human Genome Project wrapped up, Craig Venter, one of the scientists who led the effort, stood in front of the world and said plainly that race, as a biological category, doesn't hold up. When you actually compare genomes across people who identify with different racial groups, the genetic variation inside any one group is larger than the variation between groups. Two people who both check the same box on a census form can be more genetically different from each other than either one is from someone who checked a different box. The rigid categories humanity spent centuries fighting over, legislating around, building entire social systems on top of, don't have a foundation in biology. That was 2000. It was a big deal, but it turned out to be only the opening chapter. Because as sequencing technology kept getting faster, cheaper, and more precise, scientists stopped asking only about people alive today. They started pulling DNA directly out of ancient bone, out of teeth, out of finger bones preserved for tens of thousands of years in freezing caves. And what came back rewrote the human story completely. In 2009, researchers managed to sequence a full Neanderthal genome from bone fragments roughly 40,000 years old. It answered a question that had haunted anthropologists for generations. Did modern humans and Neanderthals ever actually interact? The answer wasn't a maybe. It was interbreeding, plainly written into our own genetic code. If you have European or Asian ancestry, somewhere between 1 and 2% of your genome, right now, sitting inside your own cells, came from a Neanderthal. Then, barely a year later, something even stranger turned up. From that same cave system in Siberia, scientists found bone fragments belonging to a species that had never been documented before. Not Neanderthal, not modern human, something else entirely, identified from little more than a single finger bone and a molar. They called this group the Denisovans. And just like the Neanderthals, they had interbred with our ancestors too. Denisovan DNA shows up today in people across East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands in amounts that increase the farther you travel from Africa. Two ghost populations, found through genetics alone, contributing real, measurable DNA to people alive today. That was already a lot to process. But then scientists compared all three groups, modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, side by side. And the math didn't close. There was leftover ancestry in the human genome that none of those three groups could account for. A signature belonging to a fourth population, one with no recovered bones, no teeth, no physical remains of any kind. Just a genetic echo embedded quietly in the DNA of living people, of a group of humans we have never found and cannot even name. That is the world modern genetics has revealed. Not clean branches on a tidy family tree, a tangled, overlapping web of populations that split, drifted apart, occasionally reunited, and in some cases disappeared so thoroughly that only a chemical trace remains. And that brings us to the discovery that changed everything again, one that dropped a fact so strange that even seasoned researchers had to read the results twice. A team of scientists built a new computational model designed to dig even deeper into ancestry than anything used before. They ran it against full genome sequences pulled from populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What came back was evidence of a merging event, one buried so deep in the past that no one had thought to look for it. Roughly 300,000 years ago, two separate lineages of ancient humans, lineages that had been apart for an almost unthinkable stretch of time, came back together and mixed. How long had they been apart before that reunion? Around 1.5 million years. Read that again. For over 1 million years, two distinct branches of our ancestors lived on this planet in parallel, evolving separately, before finally converging into a single lineage that eventually became us. Researchers labeled the two groups simply Population A and Population B, because nobody knows what to actually call them. Population A was the larger group. Early on, it went through a brutal population collapse, a bottleneck that nearly wiped it out, before slowly rebuilding over hundreds of thousands of years. This group ended up contributing roughly 80% of the DNA carried by every modern human. And it's also the same lineage that gave rise to both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, which is exactly why our genomes overlap with theirs. Population B contributed the remaining 20%. And here's the detail that stopped researchers cold. That 20% isn't confined to one region or one group of people. It shows up in every human population tested. Every person in Africa, every person in Europe, every person in Asia, in the Americas, on every Pacific island. This ancient merger between two lineages that spent over 1 million years apart is baked into the shared inheritance of our entire species. To put the scale of that in perspective, we already knew Neanderthal ancestry runs at around 1 to 2% in non-African populations. And Denisovan ancestry sits at a small percentage in parts of Oceania. Those numbers themselves reshaped anthropology. Population B's contribution is roughly 10 times larger than either of those. 20% of every human genome on Earth traces back to a population that separated from the main human lineage 1.5 million years ago and rejoined it 300,000 years later. And we had no idea this had happened until the right computational model finally went looking. Nobody knows exactly who Population B was. Fossil evidence put species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis in the right places at the right times to be candidates, but there's no confirmed match. What we can say with confidence is that the human family tree isn't a tree at all. It behaves more like a river system, branches splitting off, running parallel for enormous stretches of time, then merging back together, then splitting again. Now, while that discovery was reshaping how scientists think about our deep prehistory, a completely separate group of researchers was uncovering something just as jarring, but far more recent. Geneticists had already suspected that the story of human origins in Africa was more complicated than a single, simple starting point, but a study examining the full genome sequences of 28 ancient individuals from southern Africa, people who lived across a span of roughly 10,000 years, delivered a genuinely unsettling result. Every single individual dated to more than a few thousand years ago carried a genetic profile that fell entirely outside the range of variation found in any human alive today. Not near the edge of that range, outside it completely. They carried genetic variants concentrated in a way that simply doesn't exist anymore, not even among the populations most closely related to them today, groups long considered to be among the most genetically distinct and ancient lineages on the planet. Even those living populations, despite retaining a majority of ancestry from these ancient people, had shifted away from their ancestors' genetic makeup in meaningful ways over the centuries. Think about what that means. There are entire chapters of human genetic history that have been partially erased. Pieces of it survive, diluted and reshuffled in people living today. But the full, concentrated version of those genomes doesn't exist anywhere on the surface of the Earth anymore. It's gone, preserved only in bone. And then there's the discovery that might be the strangest of all, the one that takes us to a high plateau in the Andes. When researchers sequenced ancient DNA recovered from multiple archaeological sites on the high plains near Bogota, Colombia, they were looking at a set of human remains spanning an extraordinary range of time, from roughly 6,000 years ago up to about 500 years ago. The plan was straightforward. Compare these genomes against the largest reference databases in the world and map out how the ancient peoples of the Andes fit into the broader story of how humans populated the Americas. Instead, something broke. The oldest individuals in the study, 7 of them, dating back roughly 6,000 years, didn't match anything. Not the ancient populations known to have crossed the land bridge from Siberia into North America. Not the populations that spread south through Central America. Not any documented migration wave into the Americas at all. Their genomes sat entirely outside every known lineage in the region, and their skulls showed a distinct, elongated shape that lined up with just how genetically isolated they were. Scientists have a term for a population like this. They call it a ghost lineage, a group whose DNA simply does not appear in any living descendant anywhere on Earth. No mixing, no continuation, no trace passed down through the generations. Just a population that existed and then didn't. One of the researchers on the project described the moment plainly. When they compared these individuals against other ancient genomes from across the Americas, they realized they were looking at something that had never been reported before. A brand new lineage, and it was already extinct. Here's what makes it even stranger. It wasn't a slow fade, a population that gradually blended into its neighbors over time the way most human groups do. The genetic record shows a clean break. One group of people lived in that region for thousands of years. Then they were simply replaced, wholesale, by a completely different population, with zero genetic overlap between the two. No continuity, no mixing. It's as if one group closed the door behind them and a different group of humans walked in through the same doorway centuries later, with nothing connecting the two beyond geography. So where did this vanished population come from? Nobody knows. It's possible they represent an early, isolated migration into the Americas that current models simply don't account for. A wave of people who took a route or a timeline that doesn't match the standard picture of how humans reached the Western Hemisphere. It's possible they crossed into the continent long before the migrations we already know about, got isolated in the high valleys of the Andes, and lived there in genetic seclusion for thousands of years before dying out. Not necessarily through violence, but through disease, climate shifts, or the simple bad luck that comes with a small, isolated population. What we know for certain is this. They were present in the Colombian highlands at least 6,000 years ago. By roughly 2,000 years ago, they were gone. No descendants, no survivors, no continuation into the people who live in that region today. For over a century, the accepted model of how the Americas were populated involved two main lineages, a northern branch and a southern branch, both tracing back to a single founding population that crossed from Siberia. That model just picked up a third branch, one that doesn't descend from that founding population at all, one with no known ancestors and no known descendants. A population that existed and then ceased to exist without leaving a single genetic footprint in any person alive today. Step back and look at all of this together, and the picture that emerges is almost dizzying. Every human being alive carries roughly a fifth of their DNA from a mystery population that split off from our ancestors 1.5 million years ago and rejoined over 1 million years later. Ancient people in southern Africa carried genetic signatures that no living human fully inherits anymore. And in the highlands of Colombia, a population lived, hunted, raised families, and vanished so completely that its very existence was invisible to science until the right genome from the right bone fragment finally got sequenced. This is not the story that race has traditionally told. That story insists on clean separation, on groups developing their defining traits in isolation, on categories that are fundamentally biologically distinct from one another. The actual genetic record demolishes that framing entirely. What it shows instead is something far messier and, honestly, far more remarkable. A story of constant mixing and remixing, a population splitting from shared ancestors, drifting apart for enormous stretches of time, and then finding each other again, of lineages that lived full lives and then disappeared, leaving nothing behind except the faint chemical signature buried in the bones of whoever came after them. Even large-scale modern genetic surveys back this up in an unexpected way. When researchers analyzed the ancestry of hundreds of thousands of people who had self-reported their race or ethnicity, the two things frequently didn't line up. Not because anyone was mistaken about their own identity, but because the racial categories themselves are too broad and too historically arbitrary to map cleanly onto what DNA actually shows. Among participants who declined to select a race category at all, most of whom identified as Hispanic or Latino, the genetic data revealed a rich, individualized mix of African, European, and indigenous American ancestry, with proportions that vary enormously from person to person and defy any attempt at a simple label. This is part of why most geneticists today have quietly stopped using the word race in their research, not out of caution or politics, but because the word doesn't correspond to any coherent biological category. What they use now are words like ancestry, population, and lineage, terms that actually reflect what the genome is telling us, something dynamic, layered, and constantly in motion. Because here's the deepest truth sitting underneath all of this. Every single person on Earth shares common ancestors, not in some poetic, metaphorical sense, literally. Trace any two people's lineage back far enough, and the branches converge. Keep going, and you eventually arrive in Africa at a relatively small community of early humans who are, quite literally, the root of every branch of the family tree that exists today. Some of the oldest surviving branches of that tree belong to hunter-gatherer populations in southern and central Africa, groups whose lineages split off from the rest of humanity before most of the world's population had even left the continent. The deepest divisions among human beings, the ones representing the longest stretches of separate evolution, aren't between the categories that racial thinking has spent centuries emphasizing. They're within Africa itself, among populations most of the world knows almost nothing about. And then there are the lineages that don't fit anywhere in that picture at all, the Denisovans, known to us only from a finger bone and a single tooth. The fourth ghost population, whose DNA lives inside every one of us but whose remains have never been found. The ancient southern Africans whose genetic profile has been partly lost to time, and the vanished people of Bogota, who walked the high valleys of the Andes for thousands of years and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind nothing but bone and a genetic signature unlike anything else on the planet. Researchers involved in the Colombian discovery have already started expanding the search, looking at other sites across South America to see if traces of that same vanished lineage show up anywhere else. It's an active hunt carried out not with instinct or guesswork, but with genome sequencing, precise enough to read the chemical history of a person's life from a fragment of a tooth thousands of years old. What they're really chasing, underneath all the statistics and computational models, is the same question every human being has asked while looking at an old photograph or up at the night sky. Where do we actually come from? And what study after study, genome after genome, keeps revealing is that the honest answer is far stranger, far larger, and far more astonishing than the tidy version of human history most of us grew up believing. We are not separate branches occupying the same planet by coincidence. We are, every one of us, the surviving thread of a story that has been unfolding for millions of years across an entire species, on every continent. A story of lineages that split apart and eventually found their way back to each other, of populations that thrived for millennia and then disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a trace buried in someone else's bones. A species that, underneath every label we've ever tried to put on ourselves, is really just one long, complicated, deeply connected family. And somewhere in a high valley in Colombia that most of the world has never heard of, a group of people lived their entire lives, raised their children, buried their dead, and vanished without a single living descendant to carry their story forward. No language survived them, no tradition. Nothing except bone, and inside that bone, a secret that modern science only just learned how to read. The question now isn't only who they were, it's how many others like them are still out there, waiting in the ground, holding onto a version of the human story we don't even know is missing yet. If this kind of discovery fascinates you as much as it does us, subscribe, because the next one might rewrite the story all over again.